Briahna, what's on your radar?
Well, Jeanine Pirro, Fox News host and author of Don't Lie to Me and Stop Trying to Steal Our Freedom, feels strongly that the person who leaked the draft Supreme Court opinion overturning Roe should be thrown in jail. That's right, the person who is so preoccupied with individual freedom that she wrote a whole book about it believes that the leaker, who is in all likelihood a 20-something law clerk who broke no laws, should be incarcerated. Take a listen.
I don't have the slightest idea who leaked it, but I'll tell you this. Whoever leaked it did something that is unheard of in American history. I mean, you just don't leak a decision by any judge, let alone a Supreme Court justice. I mean, there is. And one of the things that we can be proud of is that the justices on the Supreme Court, they can be on the opposite side of issues, but you never hear about them not getting along. I mean, we hear about Scalia, Ruth Bader Ginsburg, the best of friends, although ideologically they were on opposite sides. So whoever leaked this, we have to find out who the person is and charge them with a crime. I don't know what the crime would be, whether it's some kind of fraud on government property. I've heard there's a statute, fraud on the government, that's very broad that could include this kind of act. But I'll tell you what's so interesting about this is if they wanted to gin up the left, who was in for an alleged bloodbath in November by the Republicans, there is no better way to do it than with Roe versus Wade.
Now, Pirro isn't concerned about establishing which crime the leaker should be charged with. You hear her fantasizing about broadening existing laws in the book so that they could just capture whatever has happened here. She articulates none of the due process concerns bandied about in the context of, say, the Kavanaugh hearings. She, a person with a law degree who is herself somehow a judge, went on national television and advocated for this person, whoever they are, to be thrown into the gulag. What's worse, she is far from the only one who adopted this take. At the New York Post, someone argued that the very integrity of the Supreme Court depends on the prosecution of the leaker. The integrity of our legal system, which I'll remind you, we value for its due process protections, its First Amendment protections, its worker protections. Well, I suppose it's worth throwing all of those things out the window in the interest of preserving judicial integrity. Now, certainly conservatives aren't the only ones who inconsistently bloviate about free speech and due process when it's their guy or gal under the microscope, all while calling for authoritarian programs when the enemy has transgressed. Hunter Biden laptop much? But that's sort of my point. So much of the arguments about free speech and cancel culture are pure ideology just dressed up in constitutional vestments that are intended to lend an air of objectivity. But it's all fake. There are some principled free speech absolutists. Glenn Greenwald will defend Julian Assange's journalistic right to leak newsworthy, classified documents and a Nazi's right to protest. But most people aren't like that. Outside of leftists and socialists and some principled libertarians, how folks feel about Julian Assange usually comes down to political ideology. Are you an It's Her Turn Hillary fan for whom Assange is the guy who leaked the emails that hurt her 2016 run? Or were you a Bernie leftist who had no attachment to Hillary or Trump, but who is deeply committed to human rights and who admires the courage it took to expose America's war crimes? If you are a libertarian who thinks the government should stay out of our lives to the greatest extent possible, do you feel differently about that depending on whether we're talking about the right to own a gun versus the right to have an abortion versus the right to leak sensitive work documents without going to jail? If you believe the leaker violated professional standards, you are right. I agree. They most certainly did. I can tell you as someone who did a federal district clerkship that the code of privacy applied to judicial process is taken very seriously. What happens in chambers stays in chambers. But when I clerked, I signed no NDA, was not bound by a civil contract, and certainly was not subject to any criminal recourse should I have violated that norm. And neither was the leaker, presuming they are, in fact, a Supreme Court clerk. If a clerk leaked the draft opinion, they will surely suffer professional consequences. In an article arguing against prosecuting the leaker, Reason journalist and Robbie colleague Eric Boehm pointed out that late Justice Antonin Scalia reportedly told new law clerks that he would, quote, ruin your career if any of them betrayed the court's confidentiality. And he could. This would be career suicide, said Carolyn Shapiro, a former clerk for Justice Stephen Breyer and a professor at the Chicago Kent College of Law. And she is right. You can't even begin to imagine how competitive Supreme Court clerkships are. And there's a reason for that. Getting one means you can earn huge salary bonuses at major law firms when you're done. It's basically a guaranteed ticket to the top. There's a reason why nearly all Supreme Court justices were once Supreme Court clerks. And losing that access after working so hard to get it should be considered punishment enough for even the most punitive institutionalist. But trying to throw the leaker in jail? I'm sorry, that just doesn't make much sense. There are no laws that explicitly prohibit anyone from leaking a draft opinion. These aren't state secrets or national security documents. Some folks have argued that various fraud statutes should apply, but it would take an activist court acting way out of bounds to make that stick. And wait, maybe I guess there is a chance of that. But in all seriousness, look, when I was a corporate lawyer, I handled tons of cases involving claims that employees had taken confidential and proprietary information with them, usually as they moved from one employer to another. Most of these cases weren't about the information at all. Firms filed suit against the other firms that poached their staffers to try to discourage poaching in the future. The employees were the assets more so than some random Excel doc with client lists. And there were consequences, significant consequences if a plaintiff won. But these were civil cases. These were monetary consequences, money damages. Folks had to pay up when employers breached non-competes, contracts. But we're not even talking about breach of contract when we're talking about the leaker, much less criminal charges. Why does this matter? Well, there's a real risk of slippage into authoritarianism when incarceration becomes a solution for dealing with people and outcomes you don't like. Look at what happened to Stephen Donziger. He's an environmental lawyer who litigated and won the largest judgment against an oil company ever. He actually got a court to find Chevron liable for massive pollution in the Amazon, 80 times more oil than was spilled in BP's 2010 Deepwater Horizon disaster. Pollution that poisoned indigenous people, causing cancer, miscarriages, skin conditions, and birth defects. But instead of paying, Chevron launched a legal attack against Donziger. They were able to use the power of unlimited corporate money to get a private law firm to represent the government in prosecuting Donziger, a highly unusual move that resulted in Donziger spending nearly 1,000 days under house arrest, including being sentenced to 6 months in jail in the middle of a global pandemic. Freedom-loving Americans, hear me out. I am begging you to consider that locking people up for saying and doing things you disagree with outside of a criminal context is not the best way to demonstrate how much you appreciate bedrock American values like due process, the First Amendment, and freedom. Some of the responses to the leak literally sound like an Onion article. SCOTUS rules that citizens don't have a right to privacy. Urge prosecution of colleagues for violating their right to privacy. Surely you can see the inconsistency here. I'm not here to tell anyone not to be upset about the leak. It's a natural response depending on your politics and what you think the motive of the leaker was. But consider resisting the march toward authoritarianism as you protest this outcome. Incarceration is a very blunt tool, and I suggest we use it sparingly. So, Robbie?
No disagreement. I mean, what do you want to say? I agree. Yeah, I said it earlier. I think it's crazy. And honestly, a lot of the people, well, I don't know. I think some of the people calling for lock them up, this is like a knee-jerk response to frustration that this happened. And if they probably thought about it a little bit longer, would realize that, no, that doesn't make any sense.
I mean, what do you think that there's so many high-profile people? The idea that Jeanine Pirro, who has a law background, hops on TV and starts wildly pontificating. I'm sure we can dig up a law somewhere to get this person in jail. I mean, that is kind of scary.
Yeah. It's dumb. I mean, what do you want to say? Yeah, I agree. I don't know that. But I will say, look, the suffering of the professional consequences being suffered for this, I think, are perfectly legitimate. And I think it's extraordinarily likely in this case that if the person is identified and it turns out that they are that the most straightforward explanation is the correct one, this is a progressive person who wants to defend abortion rights, wants to defend Roe, and thought that leaking the decision, to the extent it could possibly cause someone like a Kavanaugh to reconsider, or it could start preparing the outrage. Maybe there's nothing that can be done about that, but I think that's the most likely explanation for this person's actions. And I think in that case, this person will suffer the narrow professional consequence of no longer being a clerk for the Supreme Court or any other Republican judge, or not that they are a clerk currently for a Republican judge. That consequence, but they will things will get better for their career. They will become a hero to progressives. They'll be able to write their own ticket. They will be lionized and celebrated the way the so-called Facebook whistleblower Frances Haugen was when she came out with that information about Instagram.
Where is she
and
now?
it was I don't know, on some private eye. Wasn't she had a Bitcoin fortune?
I have no idea. But look, I will say that is perfectly possible. And I don't know what this person, whoever they are, what their long-term goals were. If their goals were to stay in the corporate sphere, it's not like law firms, as much as they might, the right might want to characterize them this way. They're not bastions of progressivism. They're just not. They're very conservative institutions. I worked at a law firm that was run by 2 out of 3 Republican partners. It was a conservative environment, and they would not look at someone who does something like this kindly. And most,
Her career in that environment's done. I agree.
If it were a money game and she was looking for these, $100,000 bonuses that you can get when you have a clerkship like this, that's off the table. And I doubt the ACLU or whatever NGO she might be able to fall back on is going to remunerate her in exactly that way. But if that's not what her interests are, or who knows?
Awards,
I'm just making up
awards, pension, that kind of thing.
Yeah.
Write a book, can become a talking head.
Yeah.
I don't know.
Well, the Inquisition is going to happen over the coming weeks, and I'm sure we'll find out more about this person soon. And we will find out more about what's coming up on Rising after this.